The mathematics of Ancestry are brutal. 15 generations back, you have 32,768 direct ancestors. Each one contributes approximately 0.003% of your genetic material. This is the problem with the claim that Queen Charlotte had visible African features from a 13th century ancestor named Madragana. Even if Madragana was fully of sub-Saharan African descent, which is historically unlikely, the genetic contribution after 15 generations becomes functionally zero. But there's a complication. European royal families practiced extreme inbreeding. The same bloodlines loop back on themselves. Could royal consanguinity have concentrated an otherwise negligible genetic contribution? The answer requires understanding both population genetics and the marriage strategies of medieval nobility. Within 6 hours of her arrival, at 9 p.m., she became Queen Charlotte, wife of King George III. The speed was strategic. The marriage needed to happen before anyone in the British court could raise objections. For over 2 centuries, historians would debate why such urgency was necessary. The answer might lie in something the palace hoped no one would notice: the new Queen's appearance. Horace Walpole, the era's most influential art critic and gossip, observed the new Queen closely. His assessment was brutally specific. She is not tall nor a beauty, pale and very thin, but looks sensible and genteel. Her hair is darkish and fine, her forehead low, her nose very well, except the nostrils spreading too wide. The mouth has the same fault. That phrase, the nostrils spreading too wide, the mouth has the same fault, would echo across centuries. Walpole was describing features, but what he didn't realize was that he was documenting something the court might have preferred to conceal. The Queen herself later admitted, "The English people did not like me much." In 1762, King George III commissioned Alan Ramsay, Scotland's most respected portrait artist, to paint the official coronation portrait of his queen. Ramsay was an unusual choice for sensitive work. Unlike other court painters who softened and flattered their subjects, Ramsay was known for one thing: accuracy. His portraits captured what was actually there. When Ramsay's portrait was unveiled, it showed features that deviated from typical Northern European royal portraiture. The skin tone was rendered darker than expected. The facial structure showed characteristics that some observers found difficult to categorize within the narrow racial taxonomies of 18th century Europe. But here's what makes this forensically interesting. Ramsay wasn't just any painter. He was a documented intellectual who opposed slavery at a time when the British Empire profited enormously from the transatlantic slave trade. The question becomes, did Ramsay emphasize certain features deliberately? Was this portrait a political statement embedded in oil paint? Or was he simply painting what he saw, while other artists, Thomas Lawrence, Johann Zisenis, Thomas Fry, softened those same features to conform to expectations? The portraits of Queen Charlotte vary so dramatically between artists that they appear to show different people. They remained dormant until 1940, when Jamaican-American author J.A. Rogers published a claim in his book Sex and Race Volume 1. Rogers wasn't making a casual observation. He was conducting a systematic genealogical investigation, tracing Queen Charlotte's family tree backward through German and Portuguese nobility. What Rogers discovered was a genealogical pathway. Queen Charlotte's mother was Princess Elizabeth Albertine of Saxe-Hildburghausen. Her lineage connected through multiple branches to a 15th century Portuguese noblewoman named Margarita de Castro y Souza. Margarita appeared in Charlotte's family tree multiple times, once in her 9th generation and twice in her 10th generation. But Margarita de Castro y Souza was just the intermediate link. The genealogical trail extended further back to 13th century Portugal, to King Alfonso III and a woman named Madragana. Historical records describe Madragana as either Moorish or Mozarab. This is where the interpretation fractures into competing hypotheses. In medieval Iberia, the term Moor did not function as a racial category. It was primarily a religious and cultural designation referring to Muslims living in the Iberian Peninsula, people of North African, Berber, Arab, and even Iberian heritage who followed Islam. The Moors, who ruled parts of Spain and Portugal from 711 until 1492, were ethnically diverse. Some had sub-Saharan African ancestry, most did not. A more probable historical interpretation is that Madragana was Mozarab, an Iberian Christian living under Muslim rule. Mozarabs were Christians who adopted certain Arabic customs and language while maintaining their Christian faith. They were culturally hybrid, but ethnically Iberian. If Madragana was Mozarab, the supposed African connection collapses entirely. Even if we assume, for the sake of analysis, that Madragana was fully of sub-Saharan African descent, which is historically unlikely, the genetic contribution becomes mathematically negligible. Madragana would have been Queen Charlotte's ancestor 15 generations back. The genetic dilution factor at 15 generations is approximately 1 in 32,768. That's 0.003%. However, this calculation assumes no inbreeding. European royal families practiced extreme consanguinity, marrying cousins to consolidate power and wealth. Margarita de Castro y Souza appears multiple times in Charlotte's pedigree because the same bloodlines loop back on themselves. This inbreeding could theoretically concentrate genetic contribution from a distant ancestor beyond what simple dilution math would suggest. Here's the problem with the inbreeding concentration theory. If Madragana's supposed African features were amplified through royal inbreeding, then Queen Charlotte's relatives, her parents, siblings, cousins, and children should have shown similar features. They did not. None of her 15 children, 9 sons and 6 daughters, were ever described as having African characteristics. Her husband, King George III, shared much of this same ancestral background through intermarriage. He looked typically Northern European. The second major piece of evidence emerged from the diary of Baron Christian Friedrich von Stockmar. In his memoirs published posthumously, Stockmar described the elderly Queen Charlotte as small and crooked, with a true mulatto face. This single phrase became the cornerstone of the African ancestry claim. But there's a chronological problem that undermines its reliability. Baron Stockmar was born in 1787. Queen Charlotte had already been queen for 26 years. Stockmar didn't arrive at the British court until 1816, just 2 years before Charlotte's death. He was not her personal physician. He served Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, who had married Charlotte's granddaughter. Stockmar only saw the Queen when she was 72 years old, in declining health, after decades of bearing 15 children and enduring her husband's descent into permanent madness. What's revealing is that Stockmar's diary describes the entire royal family with the same unflattering precision. He called the Prince Regent very stout, though of a fine figure, who ate and drank a good deal at dinner. He described the Duke of York as having immense embonpoint, and not a very intelligent face. Stockmar was not making racial observations. He was making cruel aesthetic judgments about people he found physically unappealing. Here's the forensic gap that collapses the African ancestry claim. King George III and Queen Charlotte had political enemies. British satirists and caricaturists ruthlessly mocked the royal family. They exaggerated every perceived flaw. George's mental illness, Charlotte's alleged stinginess, the children's scandals. In an era when racial prejudice was explicit and vicious, if there had been even a whisper that the Queen had African ancestry, the opposition would have weaponized it mercilessly. Yet in 57 years as Queen Consort, the longest reign until Prince Philip, no contemporary political opponent, satirist or critic ever mentioned African features or ancestry. The theory resurged in 1997 when Mario de Valdés y Cocom, a self-described independent researcher, published an article for PBS Frontline titled "The Blurred Racial Lines of Famous Families." Valdés expanded on Rogers' work, making specific claims about the Ramsay portrait, showing unmistakable African appearance and negroid physiognomy. He misspelled physiognomy. Valdés argued that Ramsay, as an anti-slavery intellectual, deliberately emphasized African features to make a political statement. Valdés's claim that Ramsay was responsible for the majority of the paintings of Queen Charlotte is factually incorrect. Ramsay painted one portrait from life in 1762. His studio then produced numerous copies for distribution across the British Empire. Other artists, Gainsborough, Lawrence, Zeedon, painted Charlotte at different ages with completely different aesthetic approaches. The variation in portraiture tells us more about artistic convention than about the Queen's actual appearance. When you analyse the full range of Queen Charlotte portraits, you see standard variation in 18th century royal portraiture. Ramsay's style used warmer skin tones and emphasised three-dimensional modelling through light and shadow. Zeedon's portrait shows Charlotte with extremely pale skin and delicate features. Thomas Lawrence painted her in 1789 as a middle-aged woman with a completely different facial structure. These differences reflect artistic training, pigment choices, and aesthetic movements, not a coordinated cover-up. In the 1970s, Dr. Joyce Hemlow at McGill University was directing the Burney Project, editing the diaries of Fanny Burney, who had served as secretary to Queen Charlotte. Hemlow obtained research from Olwen Headley, Charlotte's most recent biographer, who had collected at least half a dozen quotes by her contemporaries regarding her negroid features. This became the foundation for Valdez's later claims. But when you trace these quotes back to primary sources, they dissolve into aesthetic criticism, not racial observation. Three quotes about negroid features are actually descriptions of unconventional beauty. Walpole's comment about wide nostrils and mouth, a Prime Minister's remark that her nose is too wide and her lips too thick. Sir Walter Scott calling her ill-coloured. These are 18th century beauty standards being applied to a woman who did not conform to the narrow ideal. Pale skin, small features, delicate frame. Charlotte was described as having dark hair, darker complexion than expected, and broader features. This made her unattractive by contemporary standards. It does not make her African. Modern historians and genealogists overwhelmingly reject the African ancestry claim. Historian Andrew Roberts calls it utter rubbish and notes that scholars are reluctant to address it publicly due to what he terms the cultural cringe factor, the awkwardness of discussing race and historical interpretation. David Williamson, former co-editor of Debrett's Peerage, the authoritative guide to British nobility, stated, "It really is so remote. In any case, all European royal families somewhere are linked to the kings of Castile. There is a lot of Moorish blood in the Portuguese royal family, and it has diffused over the rest of Europe. The question is, who cares?" The theory experienced renewed attention in 2018 when Prince Harry married Meghan Markle, whose mother is black and father is white. Media outlets hailed Markle as the first mixed-race member of the British royal family, prompting advocates of the Charlotte theory to push back. What about Queen Charlotte? The Netflix series Bridgerton then reimagined Regency England with a black Queen Charlotte, explicitly drawing on this contested historical claim. When pressed, Buckingham Palace spokesperson David Buck stated, "This has been rumoured for years and years. It is a matter of history, and frankly, we've got far more important things to talk about." This diplomatic non-denial became evidence for believers, but it's equally consistent with an institution that refuses to dignify conspiracy theories with official rebuttals. We are left with two fundamentally incompatible interpretations. The first hypothesis, Queen Charlotte had visible African ancestry through a 13th century Portuguese connection, which was documented by contemporary observers, emphasized by an anti-slavery portrait artist, and systematically concealed by subsequent royal portraitists. The second hypothesis, Queen Charlotte had features considered unattractive by 18th century British beauty standards, darker hair, broader nose, wider mouth, which later researchers retroactively interpreted as African through the distorting lens of racial pseudoscience. The evidence for African ancestry consists of a genealogical connection to a woman whose ethnic identity is uncertain, 15 generations removed, one portrait that can be interpreted as showing African features, if you start with that assumption, a single diary entry from a physician who saw the Queen only when elderly, and aesthetic criticism from contemporaries describing unconventional features. The evidence against consists of the mathematical implausibility of genetic contribution at 15 generations, the absence of similar features in Charlotte's relatives, the complete silence from political enemies who would have weaponized racial ancestry, and the consensus of professional historians and genealogists. But perhaps we're asking the wrong question. The obsession with whether Queen Charlotte was black imposes modern American racial categories onto 18th century European aristocracy. In 1761 Britain, racial classification was not the binary system it became in the United States. The British Empire was beginning its massive expansion into Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. Racial pseudoscience was still being constructed. The question is not whether Charlotte would be classified as black today, which is unanswerable, but why this question matters so intensely to us now. The persistence of this theory reveals something about our relationship with history. For some, proving that Britain had a mixed-race queen in the 1700s is a powerful counter-narrative to the myth of racial purity in European royalty. It disrupts the sanitized version of history that erases African presence from European courts. For others, the theory represents historical wishful thinking, retrofitting modern racial politics onto a past that was more complex and more alien than we imagine. A. Rogers, who originated this theory in 1940, was explicit about his motivation. He was writing during the height of American segregation and Nazi racial ideology. His goal was to use the tools of racial pseudoscience, skull measurements, ancestral percentages, feature analysis to prove that the concept of a pure white race was biologically impossible. Rogers was fighting segregation and genocide by showing that European royalty had African ancestry. His methods were problematic, but his anti-racist intent was clear. Over 8 decades, Rogers' anti-racist argument mutated. What began as a tactical deployment of racial pseudoscience to combat white supremacy became, through repetition and misunderstanding, a claim about Queen Charlotte's literal racial identity. The telephone game of historical transmission, changed European royalty has Moorish connections that complicate racial purity myths. The real Queen Charlotte was a woman who arrived in a foreign country at 17, unable to speak the language fluently, married a man she'd never met, and bore 15 children. She endured her husband's descent into what we now believe was porphyria, a metabolic disorder that caused severe physical and mental symptoms. She became Britain's longest-serving Queen Consort, patronising the arts, establishing the Royal Academy of Arts, expanding Kew Gardens, and reportedly introducing the Christmas tree tradition to England. We will never know with certainty what Queen Charlotte looked like. Portraits are artistic interpretations, not photographs. Descriptions are filtered through cultural bias and personal malice. DNA analysis is impossible without remains, and the British royal family does not permit genetic testing of royal burials. The historical record is incomplete and contradictory. We are left with competing interpretations of ambiguous evidence. The claim that Queen Charlotte had African ancestry is not impossible, it's improbable. It requires accepting that a genetic contribution, diluted to approximately 0.003%, somehow manifested invisible physical features that no contemporary political enemy ever weaponized, that were only noticed by a doctor who saw her when elderly, and that required a special political motivation by one portrait artist to emphasize. The simpler explanation is that Charlotte was a German princess with features that didn't conform to 18th century British beauty ideals, whose unconventional appearance was later reinterpreted through the racial obsessions of the 20th and 21st centuries. What we can say with confidence: Queen Charlotte had Portuguese ancestry through complex European royal intermarriage. That Portuguese lineage included connections to medieval Iberian nobility during the period of Moorish rule. The term Moor in that context did not necessarily mean African. Even if it did, 15 generations of dilution make genetic contribution mathematically negligible. No contemporary source described Charlotte as having African ancestry or racialized her appearance. The theory emerged in the 20th century as part of anti-racist scholarship and was later misinterpreted as literal historical fact. History is not a choose-your-own-adventure story. We cannot simply believe what feels politically or emotionally satisfying. The evidence for Queen Charlotte's African ancestry is weak. The genealogical connection is real, but so distant as to be functionally meaningless. The portrait interpretation is subjective and contradicted by other contemporary images. The written descriptions are better explained by aesthetic prejudice than racial observation. Responsible history demands that we acknowledge uncertainty while following the evidence where it leads, even when that destination is less dramatic than we hoped. Queen Charlotte died at Kew Palace in November of 1818 at the age of 74, suffering from dropsy and pneumonia. Her husband, King George III, blind and demented, was not informed of her death. He died 14 months later, never knowing she was gone. They had been married for 57 years. Whatever her ancestry, whatever features she possessed, she had been queen of the most powerful empire on earth, at the height of the Enlightenment and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Her legacy is more complex than any single genealogical claim can capture. The question is not whether Queen Charlotte was black, a category that did not exist in the way we understand it in 1761. The question is why we need her to be, why this theory persists despite weak evidence, and what it reveals about our own time. The past is foreign. The people who lived there do not map cleanly onto our contemporary categories. Queen Charlotte was not a character in Bridgerton. She was a real woman navigating structures of power we can barely imagine. The truth of her life is stranger and more interesting than any retroactive racial classification could